Hey folks, Mr. G again. This is a continuation of part 1 of our discussion on trig ratios. We're just going to jump right into some examples. If you didn't watch part 1, please do so right now. So we want to find the value of the other two trig ratios given the following information. So if we know tangent of theta is equal to -3/4 and theta is in quadrant 4. So that tells us we're going to be looking for sine and cosine. But when you're doing these types of problems, it's really important to pick apart the information you have and use it before you try and solve directly for sine and cosine. The first piece that I think is helpful is to look at the fact that we are in quadrant 4. That's this quadrant right here, where x is positive and y is negative. That's going to be important in a second. We should also take a look at our tangent function. Recall that the tangent of an angle is the same as y over x. So if it's y over x, and we know that x is positive and y is negative, the only way that this can be -3/4 is if it's -3 over +4. So that tells us that y is equal to -3 and x is equal to +4. So back on our diagram here, that tells us our right triangle has a 4 right here, a -3 right here, and we need to figure out this length right here, our r, our radius, if we want to figure out the other two trig ratios. So recall, Pythagoras tells us that for our right triangle here, the square of our hypotenuse is equal to the square of both sides added together. So r squared is going to be 4 squared plus -3 squared. So r squared is equal to 25, which tells us that r is equal to plus or minus 5. Now, if you remember from our first video, r is always positive. So in this case, we're just interested in +5. Now that we know that r is +5, y is -3, x is +4, we can answer the question pretty easily. Since we know the values of x, y, and r, we can just plug them in, we get our fractions, and we're all done. Our next question tells us that the sine of an angle, beta in this case, is equal to 1/3, and beta is in quadrant 2. Thinking back to last time, quadrant 2 tells us that x is going to be negative, y is positive, and the sine of our angle is y over r, which is equal to 1/3, so pretty easy to see that y is going to be 1, r equals 3. And y is positive, just like we said, so that makes sense. So drawing a picture of our triangle in quadrant 2, we can see that r is going to be 3, y is equal to 1. We got to figure out what x is using Pythagorean theorem. Rearranging this, we can isolate for x squared. So x squared is 3 squared minus 1 squared. So x squared is going to be equal to 8. Take the square root of both sides. We get that x is going to be plus or minus the square root of 8. Now don't forget, we did radicals right before spring break. We can actually reduce this radical. We can pull out a 4 so that this becomes 2√2, and I would encourage you to do that. This is considered more simplified. Now to figure out whether it's positive or negative, we got to look back. X is going to be negative in this case, so we're looking for our negative answer here. Now that we know x, y, and r, we can just state what our trig ratios need to be. So for our first one, -2√2/3. For our second one, it would be 1 over -2√2. However, I would encourage you in this case to rationalize the denominator. Again, that is considered more simplified. To rationalize this, we need to get rid of our root. So by multiplying top and bottom by the square root of 2, we can do that and get -√2/4. If you're a little hazy on how exactly to rationalize denominators, take a look back at my website. There are lots of notes and examples on these types of questions. The last part of this example, now we're given an answer with decimals, and we're not actually told what quadrant it is, only that tangent of the angle is going to be positive. For these ones with decimals, we're going to answer to 3 decimal places. We're going to have to do some rounding, but that's totally fine. To figure out what quadrant we're in, since we're not told, we have to look at our two pieces of information here. So if tangent of our angle is positive, that tells us that we're in one of these two regions right here. These are the two places where tangent is positive. If cos is negative, we can't be in one of these two, because this is where cos is positive, and this is also where cos is positive. So we have to be in one of these two regions. The place where both of them is true is in quadrant 3, so we have to be in quadrant 3 for this question. And in quadrant 3, x is negative and y is negative as well. But we're still going to use the exact same thing we did before. The cosine of our angle is going to be x over r. Now, we don't have a fraction in this case, but we can take any decimal and turn it into a fraction pretty easily, just by putting it all over 1. So we can see that x needs to be our negative number, since we know x is negative in quadrant 3, and r is just going to be 1. Again, r is always positive. Once more, we're going to use Pythagoras, do a little bit of rearranging to solve for y, and eventually we get down to y squared is equal to this long, nasty decimal. Don't round it. Do not round to 3 decimal places. You will absolutely end up with rounding errors if you do it early. Keep as many decimal places as you can. So when we take the square root of both sides, we end up with this number right here. A reminder, we want the negative y, because again, we're in quadrant 3, so y needs to be negative here. This is irrational. This goes on forever. So please make sure you keep at least 3 extra decimal places. 3 extra places will usually avoid any rounding errors. Now that we know x, y, and r, we can just plug them in and get our trig ratios. After we plug it in, making sure we don't round too early, we can get our final answers, and now we can round, and we're done. Our last example is sort of a scaled down version of one of these other questions, but I really wanted to zoom in on how it works. So find the quadrants or quadrant that satisfies these two conditions. To help us with this question is really helpful to go back to that diagram that we drew, this one right here. So first what we're going to do is circle where tangent is negative in this case. So tangent is negative on these two parts, quadrant 2 and quadrant 4, because these are the two places it's positive. Now cos of our angle is negative, so that tells us it can't be here, it can't be here, it has to be one of these two positions. So where our green and blue overlap, this is going to be in quadrant 2, and that's our only answer in this case. There's only one quadrant that satisfies both of these conditions. That's the end of the video here. Take a look at some of the homework that I posted, give it a try on the assignment if that's been posted as well, and I'll see you in the next video.